Welcome everyone to this talk by Scherer. We're really happy that you're here. Anna is an assistant professor of marketing at the University of Zurich. And if you want to check out her TED Talk, is highly recommended. It deals with whether we are more or less honest towards machines than towards humans. And starts off, I just want to give a teaser, like it starts off with a very interesting anecdote from a barbecue party that Anna attended. She recently had a paper out that I'm particularly very interested in because it deals with the delegation of decisions to AI agents, which was just published in Computers and Human Behavior. And today's talk will be on the reactance to human versus artificial intelligence, when human and artificial intelligence agents lead to different reactions. So Anna, the floor is yours. If you do have questions, also those attending online, feel free to ask them in between. Anna agreed that she would be taking the questions also during the talk. Perfect. So without further ado.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here and also get your feedback on the project I'm presenting today, which is actually ongoing work. We're currently revising for a second submission to a marketing journal. And well, the whole research, the studies, and the theory has changed quite a bit, so I'm very eager to hear your feedback on this. So what is it all about? To give you a brief introduction. So we basically started with this premise that, well, artificial intelligence, right? We needed the basic premise we all have with AI, just the name implies, is, you know, it is intelligent, helps us make better decisions, drive innovation, drive humankind forward, etc. And of course, there's tons of research, and I know there's a lot of computer scientists here who probably know more about this, that there's tons of examples on where AI outperforms human decision-making in medical domains, in poker, Go, whatever. So this is not what we're focusing on. We're more focused on, does it really help us make better decisions? So when we get intelligence from AI, does it maybe then help us to overcome these human decision biases that are very well appeared in psychology? So this was kind of the starting point for this research. So to go back a little bit is obviously when we talk about how we use information from algorithms or artificial intelligence, it always goes down to this root that we all have certain assumptions or laid theories about what algorithms or artificial intelligence can do well and what it can't do really well. And it always goes back into this idea of, well, we think that algorithms are really accurate, they're reliable on the one hand, whereas when we think about agency, so thinking and planning ahead, controlling, or about experience, so experience, emotions, etc. This is where we usually feel that algorithms lack on these dimensions in comparison. And as a result of these assumptions, what we usually find is that we have a certain algorithm appreciation. So we prefer algorithms that in certain domains, for instance, computational functions. So we have this number crunching algorithm that is really reliable, very accurate. So obviously this is where we think that an algorithm will work well. So we rely on algorithms, or tend to rely more on algorithms in these domains. Also in objective tasks, where research has documented that we're more averse to algorithm when it comes to more social purposes, subjective tasks like job recommendations, but also in medical domain where we think that we want to be seen as an individual, and we think that an algorithm would have this uniqueness like. So there's certain areas or judgment domains where more reliable, or we rely more on algorithms, whereas we have others where we're less trusting that an AI or an algorithm can do that well. Clearly that is also influenced, and there's tons of research on that, by the design of the technology. Very intuitively, if we anthropomorphize technology, so the more social cues we give a technology, the more we interpret that it, is better in these social domains as well. So we attribute more agency, etc., and as a result, we trust it more in other domains as well. And as a third point, if you look at literature, the third aspect that keeps coming up, really that preference or trust in AI also depends on the individual. So there's people that have a higher dispositional trust in AI, that have more experience clearly with technology, and as such, they're more trusting in technology or algorithms in maybe even more novel domains. So in general, and that I think I'm preaching to the choir here, so I won't go into depth repeating what has been done. Just to set up our research, I think there's lots of research showing that when we prefer algorithms over human judgment and when we're willing to use them. However, if you look at the literature, obviously, if and when we use outside information, this not only depend on the source, so who is giving us the information, an algorithm or a human, but it also depends on the information itself. And as such, if you look at these, the whole literature stream on trust in algorithm or reliance on algorithms, a lot of them have kept the advice constant to kind of make this comparison if we're more trusting towards a human or an algorithm. However, if you look at literature, we find that one of the most salient attributes of information is balance. So whether a piece of information is good news and bad news, and whether or not we accept the information depends on its direction. And what research has shown is that we're inherently very, very biased. So we come towards our human decision biases. We're very biased whether or not we accept a piece of information depending on its balance. So this is kind of what we wanted to focus on in this research. And why do we think balance matters? So there's a very, very recent study in marketing that has been published that already shows that consumers react to favorable and unfavorable decisions made by humans versus algorithms very differently. So what they did is look at if people got accepted into a country club, for instance, and that decision was either made by an algorithm or it was made by a human, so the country club manager. And ultimately, that very same decision was accepted very differently depending on who communicated it. So that was already a guiding point that this balance actually matters. However, if you look even deeper into the marketing literature, there's also a very big difference on if we accept persuasive communication. So persuasion literature shows that especially when persuasion or persuasive communication is negative, people tend to be more resistant towards that information. And this is also what we find in psychology literature, what has been termed this good news, bad news effect, also known as balance-dependent belief updating or asymmetric belief updating. And this is what we wanted to focus on in this research, which basically states that people integrate positive information to a greater degree than they would. So we learn more when we have very positive news, and we learn less when we receive very negative news, which coming to the point of, the COVID in the last 2 years, we received lots of negative information to be more cautious, to consider that we might get sick, etc. All that is bad news for us. And what research would tell us is that we're not we don't take up this information very easily. Whereas if somebody tell us that our chances to win in the lottery is really, really high, we would most likely accept that information. And this is, yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Is this also like, is this the positivity and the negativity of the news itself, or even the framing?
What do you mean?
I could deliver the same news in a positive spin or a negative spin, or I could deliver positive news and negative. Do you see the?
Yeah. What we focus on is really positive news. Maybe if I go to the next slide, I can show you exactly what we did. But I think it's a very interesting point that that could be a future study to add on how that would affect differently. Yeah. So what we did is actually we took the basic literature on balance-dependent belief updating, and what we focus on, also because a lot of confusion about if it's just about confirming prior beliefs, disconfirming prior beliefs. And what we're focusing on is only information that disconfirms prior beliefs. So for instance, everybody here wants to get the research published. We have a certain maybe estimate or belief how likely that would be to get this particular paper published. And for instance, my own prior estimate might be, okay, it's 30% likely that this paper will go through. And what we want to look at and what the typical setup on belief updating studies is to give you outside information. And in this case, the deviation is always the same. So we add 20% to the estimate. So it'd be, well, I'll give you the information that it's 55% likely that we get it published. Or I give you bad news, same deviation, and it's 20%. So I give you the update, well, it's 15% likely that you get that published. So that would be constitute our bad news. So it's the same deviation for both conditions usually, just the direction of that estimate is either good news for me or it's bad news. And what balance-dependent belief updating now would say that updated estimate, if it's good news, I would update to a much higher degree. So maybe from my 35%, I would update to 50 or maybe even 55. Whereas if I receive bad news, I usually resist that information a lot more. So the rate of belief updating is a lot lower. And maybe I would say, well, it's 30%. So I only discount mine by 5% in this case. So this would be the general idea of belief updating. Again, it's not only on getting papers published, it's on how likely is it that you will get COVID, how likely will you win the lottery, how likely, tons of estimates that we have on our daily basis. And this is what we wanted to look at. And we wanted to see, well, how does the source of information affect how we integrate both positive and negative news? And can AI help us to integrate negative news in the same way that we would integrate positive news? So does it help to kind of mitigate this balance-dependent belief updating? Now, why is bad news different? So this is also from a very traditional literature, how we resist or why we resist bad news. So again, we're only talking about disconfirming your own prior beliefs. So I might have that certain estimate, and now having disconfirming information provokes me to update my prior beliefs. So if somebody's telling me to change my belief or my attitude. Now, when I hear good news, the difference is that it strengthens my prior beliefs. So for instance, with the paper being published, the example I gave before, it tells me, oh, I'm a good researcher. Or as a consumer, oh, I made a good investment choice. So I feel good about myself and I'm more likely to integrate that information. So the new piece of information I'm getting is not as threatening to me. So instead, when we have bad news, we think that there's a very different process going on. When I hear bad news, for instance, somebody telling me that getting this paper published is, only a 15% chance, I believe maybe, oh, I'm a really bad researcher, or as a consumer, I've made a bad product choice, I've made a bad investment choice, etc. And this bad news threatens our belief or our freedom to hold on to that prior belief. So we feel a sense of threat, and that increases or leads to the state of reactance. So we want to resist the information. And as a result, we expect, and this is drawing from reactance theory, we would expect reactance-style responses, including these lower belief updates when we get negative information.
Yeah, so definition of good and bad news seems to be really relying on what I believe. What if I believe data is not going to be published? I don't believe I'm a good researcher. Is it good news if somebody tells me I am?
Yeah. You're saying if you don't have this particular percentage in mind?
Yeah, let's say I believe I'm a bad researcher, but
Yeah.
somebody comes and tell me you are a good researcher.
Yeah.
Then is that good news or bad news?
Yeah, it's a good point. So in all the studies, we use these very precise percentage points to kind of also see if the rates of belief updating are different. But what you're saying is also you have more qualitative beliefs. And also these good and bad news could be more qualitative. I could tell you, not going to happen, and I'm not giving you that precise estimate. This is something we did not check, but I think it would be interesting to add on.
But I mean, like, because it's also about priorities. I mean,
Yeah.
So good news could be positive because it will bring me better outcome.
Yeah.
But it
I
could be
see.
also, but in this case, it's positive because it comes from my priority.
Mhm.
About what is the case, right?
Yeah, so it's about, I'm not sure if I understand correctly. It's about you, I mean, maybe the researcher, it's about you have made a choice or you have, submitted the paper that you believe in, and somebody's telling you, yes, this is really good. That would be good news. Confirming you as in your belief that, it's likely to get published. It's confirming your ego. You feeling good about yourself.
But in situations where, let's say, my collaborator submitted to a top place, but I don't believe it's going to get accepted, and somebody comes and say, look at it. That's good.
Now I get what you're meaning. Okay. So it would be so you would not have a very positive view about yourself in this case. That would be an interesting twist too. I would still think that this is counted as good news, but this is something we didn't check. Yeah.
I think like in relation to this, I think like the assumption that reaches this point is that we update better with good news than bad
Yeah.
news.
Yeah.
And I think some personality disorders, for example, limit that, like
Yeah.
depression, where it would be like in a different direction. So I think this relates to this
Yeah.
maybe indirect.
I think, yeah, it does. So the way we started off with this research is also talking about optimism bias. So we're usually inherently optimistic about anything that is related to ourselves. So we usually think that we are very likely to win the lottery, or we are very likely, that our research gets published. Whereas when you ask about others, we have usually much lower estimates, which is the typical optimism bias that you observe with most people. So we never even thought about somebody being so maybe I guess also realistic about themselves. So this was also one of the starting points, having this optimism about anything that is related to the self. Yeah. And then this valence-dependent belief updating ultimately adds on, leads to that optimism bias. Yeah. So again, this was just the basic premise that we have. How do we actually, or why do we expect to have lower belief updating when we have negative news? And we added this whole process because we wanted to explain, how does the source of information affect this underlying mechanism? And this is where our idea of the information.
Can I ask a question as well?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm the big brother. No, well, I'm interrupting because it's a bit related to what others were already asking. The term coming to my mind is anchoring bias, and I was wondering in terms of framing, I really like how you operationalized valence, but it's not as easy for me to see if some sort of anchoring discomfort, or is that the balance of the news that you are measuring here?
Can you explain what you mean with the anchoring right here?
Well, by anchoring bias, I mean when people have an expectation or they are provided with an initial estimate of a number and then they have to make a guess later. The anchoring effect is, how much biases they have around the initial estimate. Basically, we stick to the initial information, and any deviation from that costs us, it has a cognitive cost. And the bigger the deviation, of course, the more discomfort we experience.
Yep.
I think it's just as a matter of framing, really, and because it's an area that I'm not very
I think it froze.
Oh. I think I got the question. Okay, so it's not
Maybe
just
we
me.
can move on, and when Taha comes back, we can revisit the question.
Yeah. All right, maybe even it becomes clear when I explain the design and how we did that.
Okay.
All right, so I feel, okay, maybe we'll try that later. Or did you want to add?
Are you able to see video? Like, okay, so the network is fine. It's from the task.
We'll try again. Let's. Okay, so now let me explain what we think is actually the novel aspect of this research, which is trying to figure out how AI could help us in this situation to kind of mitigate that balance-dependent belief updating. And actually, when you go back into, we draw a lot from reactance theory, right, earlier, why we resist that negative information. And the original theory in itself, the authors already proposed that reactance arousal, the magnitude that we experience, depends on who essentially restricts our freedom. So they're already mentioning that, you know, the source of information plays a crucial role here. And there's two ideas that support this in recent research. One is there's research showing that we have an in-group out-group differentiation. And we have a higher or a greater reactance arousal when the information comes from in-group members, and we have a lower reactance arousal when out-group members. And if you consider that this in-group out-group differentiation originates from social distance, and we perceive to have higher social distance clearly to a computer or an algorithm than to another human, that already made us believe, okay, that maybe if the source of information is an artificial agent, that would induce lower reactance. And another reason why I believe this is the case is in the original theory, the authors state that the magnitude of reactance arousal depends on the agent's intention to persuade. And from AI and algorithm literature, we know that artificial agents tend to be perceived to be not driven by any autonomous goals, their own intentions. So we believe that people essentially assume since they have a low intentionality, they're not trying to persuade you, and as such, they will not lead to such a high reactance arousal than any other social agent would. And indeed, there's one study that we found on social robotics that kind of is already going into that direction. They measured degrees of social agency of either a social robot or a robot that didn't have any social cues, was not anthropomorphized. And what they found is that reactance arousal was already higher when people were acting with that social robot. And ultimately, that led us to this kind of model that we wanted to test is, well, we have this negative information. This negative information by itself would be perceived very threatening to our attitudinal freedom. That would increase our reactance arousal and lead to that lower belief updating. However, if we have, and that information is delivered by an artificial source, we believe that this threat through negative information does not lead to a high reactance arousal. And as a result, it can help us integrate negative information more and then reduce that balance-dependent belief updating. So ultimately, this is what we wanted to test. Again, the theory part, a lot of it is new, so I'm eager to hear if you have any comments on that. But for now, I can give you a short overview on some of the studies that we did. At the moment, we have a series of 5 experiments. We have 1 proof of concept field study and 4 more controlled experiments, very different or differing in the tasks and also differing in the populations of samples that we drew. So we were working with managers, SME owners, but also for some of the study were in Zurich, etc. One important point here is that all of the tasks were more what would be considered algorithm appropriate. So we did not use any subjective tasks or social purposes that I said before, because we're not interested in when people prefer an algorithm over a human. So we wanted to have tasks where they would consider both the advice of an algorithm and of a human expert in the same manner. This is why most of the studies are more on investment and finance domain. But this is also coming from Switzerland, where this is a very popular industry, probably also one where you could easily have a field study. So the first study that we did maybe let me briefly explain the general outline of all of the studies. So all of the studies we did, very common procedure used in belief updating experiments, where participants receive some market information, and for instance, on stock developments, etc. Then they have to give a first initial estimate. So how likely do they think that this investment will perform well? Then they receive new information, in our case, either from an artificial agent or a human agent, and differing in balance, so either good news or bad news. One point here that I wanted to make, of course, there's lots of research also on trust AI. They also give new information, but the big difference to our research is our advice deviation is always the same. So we either add or subtract a particular percentage from the participant's initial belief to keep the advice deviation constant, to obviously observe if positive or negative information is integrated in a different way.
A really quick question on this. So if the initial estimate is very extreme,
yeah,
what do you do then? Like if I say there's 90% chance and you cannot add 15%.
Yeah. So we had to actually get rid of some of the participants. So unfortunately, luckily not many of them were in the upper extremes, but I will report that in the last study we did have a problem.
Okay.
But what we did is when they were, for instance, I don't know, 83%, and then we multiplied by 1.3, etc. We would still give them that 100% estimate, even though they were higher, would be higher. And then we calculated the actual deviation, and we allowed deviations between 20 and 30% in our sample. So keep it kind of constant, and we controlled for the actual deviation then.
But that means there are some people that had like basically 100% estimate afterwards, right? So there was no uncertainty for them anymore, right?
So, well, that was the agent's belief. Yes.
Okay.
So we went up to 100%.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, and after they received the information, we basically captured. We gave them the chance to update their beliefs. So we asked them again, what do you think about, the investment that you made, the choice that you made after receiving that information, captured that estimate again to kind of calculate our rate of updating. The rate of belief updating, depending on so again, the outside information, when it was positive news, the outside information was higher than the initial estimate. So if I think my chance of getting published is 35%, then the outside information would have been maybe 50%, for instance. And reverse, when it's a negative, it would be lower than the initial estimate. And basically, the rate of belief updating is taking the difference between the participants' estimates divided by the agent information, and the difference between agent information and the initial estimate that they made. So ultimately, that rate of belief updating is between 0 and 1. 0 would mean there's no updating at all. They would stick to their prior belief. If the rate of belief updating is 1, they would completely take over that update from the agent that they have. So the higher that value, the more belief updating. But again, we do not differentiate. There's no minus or plus between positive and negative, because we're only interested in the decrease. So is there any difference between these positive and negative rates of belief updating?
Whether can people over for example, the agent price?
No, but this was actually, so by our design, they could not. But this is actually something where we experienced problem with our last studies. Yeah. So maybe that's something to think about for future studies as well. Yeah. All right. So then, yeah, that was our first study where we kind of wanted to see if there's actually something going on, if you find some differences. What we did here is we collaborated with a fintech in Switzerland. Luckily, we have a lot of them. This is a startup that has developed a algorithm for online loans, particularly SME loans, which are not online yet. And what is typically in the past has been done by loan offers, so an SME owner, if they want to have financing by a bank, they would have to go to the bank, they would go through their financial information, balance sheets, then they would calculate their credit worthiness, the risk of default, and depending on that rate they would calculate, they would get a certain interest rate for their loan. What they did is they kind of developed their own very easy algorithm, so people can go online and don't have to enter these 200 pieces of information that you would do offline, but very simple process to go through. You enter that information and immediately the algorithm would calculate your credit worthiness and what your particular individual interest rate for that loan would be. And luckily for us, they wanted to test different versions of their website because they were interested in, you know, if this used to be an offline process, how can we get users to this online tool, to trust that online tool? So they were testing a more humanized version of the website and a very artificial, kind of very functional setup of the website that we use for our different sources of information. Just to let you, and the ultimate question that we were interested in here is, what if people are told that the interest rate that they get for their loan is higher or lower than we expect? So ultimately what we did in this study is we kind of asked them, you know, what do you think an appropriate interest rate would be for you and your company? And then they would go through that tool, enter their financial data, and then get that estimate from the online tool. Yeah.
And you randomly assign them to be over, like?
No,
okay.
Not in this case. In this case, the information that they received was actual information that, you know,
okay.
on the algorithm, depending on their credit worthiness, what kind of interest
okay.
rate they would get. But we simply calculated later if, you know, their estimate was higher or lower, we kind of assign them to either
okay.
good or bad news. Yeah, but that's a big difference to the other studies that we had. Okay. So this is kind of the website that we had. So they went in, they could test it. Apart from that artificial versus humanized setup, we have two more versions that the startup wanted to test that I will not focus on here today was a high versus low transparency. So in the end, when they received their interest rate, what would happen? I can show it maybe right here. So this was kind of on the left is our artificial agent setup. So they enter their basic balance sheet information. And in the end, what they received, you see at the bottom, in this case, they received good news. And you see that on this Bonitätsbewertung, so kind of on your credit worthiness scale, you're really good. So you are here. And then they received information. In this case, their credit rate would be, interest rate would be 2.2%. And for our humanized agent, we have this conversational flow. So it kind of looked like they were interacting with a loan officer that simply asked them the same information, enter your balance sheet information, etc. And in the end, they also received, you know, oh, compared to market average, you're really good. Your credit worthiness is really high. And this is why you received this interest rate. For the transparency condition, the only difference was this little bottom button that they had where they could receive an explanation why they received a particular interest rate. So in this case, what they did is try to make the algorithm more transparent and tell people, you know, why maybe your, I don't know, liquid assets were too low, etc. And this is why your credit rate is so high. Well, the most interesting aspect for us is after they received this information, we asked them again, you know, do you think this is inappropriate? What do you think your interest rate should be? And kind of also followed up on, you know, would you check with other banks? Would you go to other portals or would you trust this information? And ultimately what we found what you can see right here, these are the main results. The first thing you see is obviously with bad news, the rate of relief updating is a lot lower in general compared to the good news, where people are more likely to integrate and update their reliefs. So we see this balance-dependent relief updating regardless of the design of the website. But we found that in general, when the participants received these bad news, they updated their beliefs more when they had this very functional artificial setup of the website. So this was for us a first indicator that there is something going on, that maybe this algorithmic setup could help, well, that people do not resist the information as much. Also, one point I didn't mention before, so participants in this case were SMEs, because the website was for SMEs, and they could had to have their own financial data and enter that. Now we followed up with a couple of studies. The first one we did was an investment game, so we kind of wanted to stick to the same area. But in this case, they did not have this personalized update. But again, we just added or subtracted 30%. In this case, we added and subtracted either 30 or 20% to have this positive or negative news. We also had positive and negative information, and we had the artificial and human setup.
Can I ask, so in the collaboration with Updat, was it done in the app?
It was an
On the website, so you recruited the participants to a separate website that you ran? Or was it part of their website, their own website?
Of the startups website? Yeah, of the startups website.
Okay, and then the, maybe I missed it. What was the estimate, like they revised, like were they making an actual implementation? Or were they guessing like something?
So what we said is it was, so we had a panel provider that recruited the SMEs, and the idea was to have this, you know, we wanted to test our new service. So they were invited by the startup. They first explained what the startup was all about. And then they say, well, you know, assume you want to have an investment of, I think it was 100,000 for 3 years, and then go through. And we kind of wanted to know from them first, what do you expect, would you pay, what kind of interest rate you would pay for that. Then they went through the process, received that interest rate, and then we asked them again, you know, now what do you think, depending on that feedback, what the interest rate would be.
So there were hypothetical scenarios with a real.
Yes.
Stuff.
Yes. Yeah. This is why it's really hard to kind of, it's not a field experiment in that sense. It's still, they knew they were part of a study to test it. But still they received and went through the whole process that they would on a regular website. Yeah. Yes, and with this case, so the second type of study that we did was on an investment game. In this case, the basic question was, what if people are told that their investment is likely to perform worse or better than expected? So they had to choose an investment, tell us, you know, how do you think that investment will perform? And ultimately, an outside agent would either give them good or bad news on that particular investment that they chose. We also incentivized that decision. And then they could update their beliefs again. So very similar setup. In this case, we had a very simplistic investment game. So it's basically a video showing the performance of 3 stocks over 6 periods. These were only shown for 1 second, so it was a very brief video. We randomized the development. And in this case, all stocks are basically the same. So each stock goes up 3 times and down 3 times in random order. So there's no stock that is objectively better, only the belief that the agent later thinks that the particular stock they chose is better or worse than they expect. That's the only difference that we wanted to have in the design. And then again, we asked them about their estimates, their decision, and then they received different advice, again, by an artificial and a humanized agent. This time it's either a chat with AI, or chat with our Vincent Porter, I think. So we had a human picture, and they went through that process. And ultimately, in the end, and I'll let them again, they either received the information that the investment that they chose would be better. And this again is by, you know, the deviation, keeping that distance the same by having that 30% plus or having that 30% minus their initial estimate in the end of the chat. And then we asked them about their belief updates again. And what we found here, again, we see that You find that there's valence-dependent updating when they interacted with the humanized agent. So where positive information is integrated a lot more than negative information. But when they received bad news, you can see on the right-hand side, participants updated the relief significantly more than when they interacted with that humanized agent. So again, that kind of gave us the idea that AI or artificial agents can help reduce that valence-dependent belief updating. We also looked at loyalty intentions here. That was interesting, and we're still a little bit puzzled. So loyalty intentions tend to be obviously really low when they receive bad news. The interesting aspect is that the difference between when participants interacted with the artificial agent, there was no difference between receiving good and bad news. But when they received the information from the humanized agent, it was valence dependent. So they were had really high loyalty intentions. They received good news and really low loyalty. Okay, then we did another task.
We are approaching like 45 minutes, so if
Yes.
you want to get some.
Yes.
Yeah.
I will actually skip a few studies. Just give you a brief outline on another task that we did, very similar in this case, real estate, and that was on Qualtrics and Enter. Again, very similar aspect on what if you're told that your investment is likely to perform worse or better than expected. In this case, they had to choose between 3 different real estates and which one would be the one that is the best performing in terms of price increases. We try to make the human agent more human. So in this case, we had actually a video where the agent introduced himself in this case, which was, however, pre-recorded because we did not have individual interactions. Other than that, very similar design, again, also with the good news and bad news. What we did here is, because we did not use in all the other studies before, we used managers or SME owners, very experts in their field. In this case, we used Qualtrics and Mturk. And we were wondering, if that valence-dependent belief updating is stronger when people are experts in their area because they're more resistant to receive that negative news. So when we look at average levels of knowledge, we again find that there have that valence-dependent belief updating with human agents, and that the negative information is integrated more when they interact with a humanized agent, an artificial agent. But interestingly, when we look at different levels of knowledge, we see that this effect is most pronounced for people that are experts, that perceive to have a very high knowledge in their area. And the effect is no longer holds when they're not perceived in the area. So this seems to be an important aspect as well. For the 4th study, we tried to, and this is where we look at our whole process that we came up with. We looked at threat to autonomy. Maybe one question that might come up, that usually comes up, is wouldn't the moderator be on the first stage? So can there's some research showing that people do not perceive to be reduced in their autonomy when they interact with artificial agents. And we checked for that, and we did not find that the source moderates the first stage. So it is on the 2nd stage. And finally, we did a final study, kind of bringing it together with our field study on car leasing, again on Mturk. In this case, we asked people to go through an assessment form. So again, we captured their personal information, so very similar to the first study, and for a particular car. And then we gave them information, this comparison website, and they tell them that their car leasing rate would be higher or lower than expected. In this case, so this was the setup, the car leasing, the car model that they presumably wanted to apply for. And in this case, we also had 3 agents. So we kind of wanted to see the differences between having a very artificial agent or humanized agent with then, conversational flow, already having a name versus a very human agent with picture, to kind of observe these differences more closely. Again, we had the good news and the bad news. And this is a study that we still struggle with a little bit. I mentioned that before, because in this case, a lot of people were very optimistic and assumed that their car leasing rate would be the lowest that we had on our scale. And probably, especially when we wanted to give them negative news, we had a problem because we couldn't go below. And deleting them from a sample would already be a problem because then we would delete the very optimistic people in our negative information condition. So we didn't do that. And in this case, we didn't look at belief updating as a reactance-style response, but we looked at the reactance arousal and other reactance measures, which was our way out of this kind of design flaw. So in this case, we looked at the whole model that we proposed before, but instead of looking at belief updating, we looked at the effect on satisfaction and loyalty intentions instead of belief updating. And what we find is actually the model that we proposed, that the source can help reduce that relationship from threat to autonomy to reactance arousal. However, only when we look at the comparison of the very artificial agent and the human agent. The humanized agent was not significant. Yeah. And with that, I'm closing up. Sorry for going over time a little bit. So basically what we wanted to show with this research is trying to find out if AI can help us reduce decision biases. So there's tons of decision biases that we engage in. This asymmetric or valence-dependent belief updating is one of them, and we wanted to see if AI can help us learn better or integrate negative information better or more consistently than is the case currently. We also did a couple of interviews with CEOs in Switzerland to kind of see if this is really relevant for them in a corporate setting. And obviously, there's lots of ideas and scenarios where you have to confront also your employees with negative information. Maybe their time planning, their scheduling is too optimistic. And she was telling us in this case that in this case, it might be really helpful to have AI at least part of the discussion saying, you know, emphasize that there is an algorithm telling you that this might be too optimistic, can help reduce the resistance to such discussions with employees. Also from a marketing standpoint, and with that, this is second to last slide, we think that this research can help companies a way out or give them a way out of a lose-lose situation. So there's actually a lot of situation where you have to give citizens, also consumers, negative information. I mentioned COVID before. Obviously, it could be, you know, the growth rate of your retirement plan at the moment, investments that you've made. And this is a lose-lose situation for companies. Either they tell you, you know, your investment's not going really well, which is bad news they do not like to hear, or you kind of, well, countenance these optimistic beliefs of these customers and lose it. And we believe that a way out here is that companies can at least emphasize AI-based advice when they have to give this negative information, so consumers will not be as resistant to the information that they're receiving. And finally, a lot of them we already discussed. There's a lot of limitations still in this research, also in the studies. We did not have any real human interaction, so there's no face-to-face conditions that we tested. Our idea was, though, that there's tons of studies showing valence-dependent belief updating in human interactions, so this was not the focus. The focus was actually on the artificial agents condition, and we show that here this valence-dependent belief updating can be reduced. One particular problem that we have is that we have no strong beliefs in most of our tasks. You see that in our initial task, when people had to enter their balance sheets, this has been valence-dependent belief updating was most pronounced because it probably was most ego-threatening to the participants. And this was really hard to do with these artificial setups when, you know, imagine you choose one investment. So we used bonus payments to kind of incentivize them to use, you know, to make a good choice and to stick to that choice. But still, you see that there's big differences, again, also with these mTurk samples. And finally, I think this was one aspect that came before. We did not change the message styling in any way. So we only use these, you know, percentages, 85% likely, etc. I think one very interesting aspect here could also be humans in general communicate very differently than obviously algorithms. So we expect an algorithm would say, well, it's 85%. Whereas a human could say, well, it's probably going worse, or this is not as good. And having that ambiguity and communication would be an interesting aspect to look at, because it leaves a lot for interpretation, and as such could have a very big effect on this research as well. But that is up for future research, and with that, I want to close, and I'm very, very happy that you stick a little bit over time. So thank you very much for the attention, and I'm happy to get your feedback.